right, let's go to Matthew 24. Continuing in our study of the Olivet Discourse. This has been a lengthy series. I don't ever remember giving 5 messages on Matthew 24, but the subject is of great importance. So much more as we see the day drawing near, as it says in Hebrews 10, and also 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven, then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Well, that's what we're doing here in this series. Up until now in the study, we've been looking into Jesus' answer to the disciples' question, what will be the sign of your coming? And this is answered in Matthew 24, 4 through 31. By this time, we should have from memory the 4 signs that Jesus gives that will indicate his soon return. Verse 14, the gospel will be preached as a witness to all nations, sign number 1. Sign number 2, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. Verse 21, then there'll be a great tribulation. And then verse 29, the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then will come the sign of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, there are other signs of Jesus' soon coming, which we read about in other New Testament prophecies, such as the nation of Israel restored to the land, the rise of this world leader called the Antichrist, confederation of 10 nations. But those prophetic details are subsumed under each of these 4 major signs. But after verse 31, Jesus begins to answer the other question of the disciples, when? Now, this is not some personal outline of the text. The distinction is quite obvious. That in verse 32, Jesus switches to answering the first question of the disciples. When will these things happen? And Jesus begins to answer this question with an illustration. The exact timing of Jesus' coming will not be given, but it'll be like when a tree buds. You know that winter is soon over and summer is near. Verse 32, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all of these things, recognize that he's near, right at the door. So it's quite obvious that Jesus is saying that there will be signs to look for that will precede his coming. And when you see these signs, don't discount them. Don't ridicule them as crackpot end-time sensationalism. Don't simply say this is nothing, but we're to recognize that he's near, not just near, but Jesus says, when you see these signs, I am right at the door. We'll hear our Savior walking up the footsteps. So we know that unbelievers will not recognize when Jesus is near, but we will recognize it. We'll be watching. But even Christians could use a little more help in recognizing when Jesus is near in their Christian walk. We ought not to ignore the prophetic word. Now, jumping down to verse 36, we see that Jesus qualifies what he's saying. Even though we may know when Jesus is near, Jesus says the exact hour and day no one knows. And for the last 2,000 years, the church could never foretell when these signs would begin. And hence, we don't know when Jesus is coming. But once the signs begin, we know that the coming of Christ will be for that generation. One point to note, the second coming of Christ is different from the first coming of Christ in this regard. Because the timing, the year of Christ's first coming was foretold, so that the people would be able to identify the Messiah. The timing of the second coming is not foretold. Because in the second coming, there's going to be no need to identify the Messiah. It's going to be obvious. Because as it says in Matthew 24, 27, for just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. But in the first coming, the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 is that we're given the year of Christ's first coming. Daniel 9:25, so you're to know and discern that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So this text is saying that there are going to be 483 years until the Messiah, or from the time the decree from Persia to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah would be 483 years. Now in Jewish counting, that's 7 sets of 7 and 62 sets of 7. So the people at this time knew when the Messiah would arrive. And we reckon the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem at about 450 BC, give or take a few years. 483 years from that date we arrive at about AD 26 or 27, when Jesus announced himself to Israel at his baptism, when Jesus commenced his ministry. And the Jews in the first century could have set their calendars by this. That's why when Jesus arrived the first time, there were messianic expectations. But in the second coming of Christ, we don't have this specificity. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to have a verse in the Gospels that says from the time that the temple is destroyed in AD 70 until the coming of the Son of Man will be 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever. That might seem like a nice prophecy to have, but could you imagine how that knowledge could affect us negatively, both the saved and the unsaved? Since we're sinful creatures, there's some knowledge we ought not to have because we would misuse it. Adam and Eve should have realized this in the garden, because God's first and only prohibition was to not partake of knowledge prematurely. Isn't that interesting? As far as the first prohibition. So if I was a rabbi in 100 BC and you were to ask me when the Messiah would arrive, I could give you a date. But if you ask a pastor at any point in the last 2,000 years, when is Jesus going to arrive in his second coming, he could not give you a date. So the illustration now of a fig tree putting forth leaves is pretty straightforward. Everyone knows that when the trees are beginning to bud, summer's coming. The budding trees along the fence here tells me always that warm weather is coming. But there is more behind this illustration than just the tree budding means that summer's coming. The reference to the fig tree may itself be an additional sign. Because throughout the Old Testament, the nation of Israel was referred to as the fig tree, such as in Hosea chapter 9, verse 10. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers as the earliest fruit on the fig tree in its first season. Now, after reading such texts such as Hosea 9, if we still wonder if the fig tree has any reference to the rebirth of national Israel, remember that at the beginning of the Passion Week, just a couple of days before Jesus is teaching his disciples on the Mount of Olives, Jesus cursed the fig tree. Matthew 24:19, seeing a lone fig tree by the road, Jesus came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, no longer shall there be any fruit from you. And at once the fig tree withered. Now, it's quite obvious to any student of the Bible that Jesus was not angry with the tree because it didn't have fruit on it. This was clearly a symbolic action representing the failure of Israel to bring forth fruit of righteousness. Israel had a profession of fruit, but had no true righteousness and godliness. And so God set the nation aside. But now, 2 days later, we read Jesus saying, look for the fig tree putting forth leaves, the fig tree that was cursed. And other prophecies tell us that at the end of this age, God will restore Israel, and there will again be a saved remnant coming from the physical descendants of Abraham. Remember, Jesus said, you'll not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Seems as though Israel will have another occasion to receive her Messiah. A few Old Testament texts in this regard, Ezekiel 36, for I will take you from the nations, gather you from all of the lands, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all of your filthiness and from all of your idols. So there's going to be return to the land of Israel and some sort of conversion. Could this be referring to the return to Israel after the Babylonian exile in the 5th century BC? Well, the prophet Zechariah, who lived after the Babylonian return, prophesied of another coming exile and return. So this could not just simply be referring to what happened in the 5th century BC. Zechariah chapter 10, verse 6, I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and I will bring them back, because I have had compassion on them, and they will be as though I had not rejected them, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. Verse 8, I will whistle for them and gather them together, for I have redeemed them, and they will be as numerous as they were before. And Israel, once back in the land, will play a role in end-time apocalyptic events. Chapter 12, verse 2, behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all of the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. Then chapter 12, verse 5, then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through the Lord of hosts, their God. In that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot among pieces of wood and a flaming torch among sheaves, so they will consume on the right hand and on the left all of the surrounding peoples, while the inhabitants of Jerusalem again dwell on their own site in Jerusalem. So this prophecy doesn't really refer to AD 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, because the Lord didn't deliver the nation at that time. This prophecy clearly speaks about what will take place before the glorious coming of the Lord. And if the Jews were not back in Palestine right now, it'd be hard to imagine how these prophecies would take place. So we ought to learn from the parable of the fig tree. It involves much more than just signs will precede the coming of Christ. One of those signs appears to be Israel herself, the fig tree, coming to life and putting forth leaves. And this is why Bible teachers emphasize and point to the restoration of national Israel in 1948. That Israel would be a nation again after 1900 years of being spread throughout the entire world is really the providence of God. I can't think of any other people group that have been dispersed throughout the entire world for centuries and then have their land and their nation restored. Can you? And language. Now, it's because of this prophecy that some prophetic teachers back in the 1960s and the 1970s were saying that Jesus will return before 1988. Because Jesus said this generation that sees these signs will not pass away until all of these things take place, and a generation in the Bible is 40 years. So 40 years from 1948 brings us to 1988. But the mistake that was made is that Jesus actually said, when you see all these things. The main sign is not necessarily the restoration of Israel, but when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. When you see the great tribulation, the generation that sees those things will not pass away without seeing the coming of Christ. So let's look at that next statement from Jesus in Matthew 24:34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, as I mentioned in earlier messages, some mistakenly read this to mean that the disciples will see all of these signs and the coming of Christ in their lifetime. The point is, who is Jesus referring to when he says, when you see all of these things? And who is he referring to when he says this generation? Is Jesus saying that his disciples will see these things? No, this is a very common figure of speech used in prophetic languages, in prophetic prophecies, and we use this figure of speech today. Let's say I was teaching someone how to use a computer, and I said to this person, well, when you see this particular error message come up, you need to do this or that. Am I promising him that he's going to see that error message come up? No, I'm saying it's a conditional statement. If you see such and such a message, then you do such and such. Well, Jesus is saying that the generation that begins to see these signs will see the coming of the Lord. And as we read in the rest of the New Testament, there is not a single word from Paul or Peter or James or John saying that the church should expect the coming of Christ during the days of the apostles. Now, if you can find that text, one that says that, in case I have never seen it before, please let me know. So what's the point? Well, one commentator on Matthew 24, it's actually a commentary that Rich Delfino dropped off for me to look at. He said this, another interpretation applies the words to that final generation before the coming of Christ. But this would be a truism, too obvious for Jesus to have mentioned it. So this commentator takes the words, this generation, to mean the Jewish people themselves. In other words, the Jewish people will not pass away from the earth until all of these things are fulfilled. Well, that would also be a truism, too obvious for Jesus to have mentioned. I think the commentator is making a mistake in assuming that Jesus was simply saying that these things will happen to the final generation, which of course that's going to be true. That again would be too obvious for Jesus to mention. But if we read the text carefully, Jesus is saying that the generation that begins to see these signs take place will not pass away until all of these things be fulfilled. That's the important point. The generation that sees the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation is to know that the coming of Christ is going to be in their lifetime. It's not as if the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation will take place, and yet the coming of Christ will be centuries away. The whole point is that the generation that sees these signs needs to look up, for the redemption is drawing near. Jesus, for that generation, will be right at the door. And this is the comfort that this future generation will need. As it says in verse 22, the days will be cut short for their sake. And then Jesus adds these additional words of comfort, that what is prophesied will surely take place. Heaven and earth, the most stable, true thing in our world, by which we can set our clocks, will not always be faithful and consistent. But Christ's words will be faithful. The prophecies will be fulfilled. Now, some have taken Matthew 24:35 to be a verse about the historic preservation of our Bibles. And of course, this verse could have some remote application to the preservation of biblical manuscripts. But the main point is that Jesus' prophetic word concerning these coming events and his coming will surely be fulfilled. As sure as we're sitting here today, the Lord is going to return in glory. Most people don't see that prophecy as an actual event. But the more we who know the Lord grow in the Lord, the more convinced we become of its reality. The more everything we do in life is influenced by that prophecy. So now Jesus gives a second illustration. The first illustration was of the fig tree. The next illustration is of Noah and the flood. Remember the question that Jesus is answering. Chapter 24, verse 3, tell us, when will these things happen? Then in chapter 24, 32 through 35, Jesus is saying they will happen when you see signs. But now Jesus gives another illustration to further answer the disciples' question. Matthew 24:36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. And again, the point, even though there will be signs preceding the coming of Christ, showing us that he's right at the door, still the exact day and hour, no one knows. It's going to be a surprise upon the unbelievers. And this likely explains why in the book of the Revelation, we don't have a single verse that specifically states that at such and such a time, believers will be raptured off the earth and taken to heaven. We read in Revelation 1:7, the Lord's coming on the clouds and every eye will see him, but no chronology is given there. We read in Revelation 19 that the Lord appears to destroy the nations at Armageddon, but there's no text that says anything similar to Matthew 24:31, which says Jesus will now send forth his angels, and with a great trumpet, he will gather his elect from the four winds. Now, in the book of the Revelation, we read about angels being sent forth to do many things. But there's silence concerning when the angels come to actually gather the elect in reference to the chronology and the events of the tribulation. So now comes this illustration of Noah and the flood. And the point is the suddenness and the surprise of Christ's coming. Not for us, because we will see the signs. We will lift up our eyes, for redemption is drawing near. Just like Noah and his family was fully assured that the flood was coming. And they made preparations by building the ark and getting it on board. So also with God's people in the second coming of Christ, we will recognize that his coming is near, and we will be ready to get on board. But the unsaved world, just like in Noah's day, they'll be going about their business, totally unaware of what's about ready to take place. Paul repeats this truth in 1 Thessalonians 5:1. Now, as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. Paul's referring back to what Jesus is going to say here in Matthew 25. While they say peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. So Paul is saying, I don't have to explain to you the timing of the Lord's coming. You know, certainly even from Jesus' words, that it will come upon the world as a thief in the night. In fact, it will come upon the world in a day in which the world will be boasting about how secure they are. Notice also that the surprise is not merely to the coming of Christ, but encompasses the surprise over the coming of the day of the Lord, the apocalyptic judgments. So that when the nations say, we finally have peace in our day, then these apocalyptic wars and cataclysmic natural disasters will come upon them. Now back to the Olivet Discourse here. In the same way, the surprise is not just in the coming of the Lord, but the whole flood of the day of the Lord. The eating, the drinking, the marrying is not speaking about sinful activities, though they could be. But people are going about their normal business, not realizing that the world is passing away. 1 John 2, do not love this world. The world is passing away, and the lust thereof. But he that does the will of God abides forever. You know, we who are Christians, we don't have our hopes and our aspirations in this world, as do unbelievers. We're not trying to lay up for ourselves treasures upon earth. We're looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. We're temporary sojourners in this world. Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, our citizenship is in heaven, from which also we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Notice verse 39. It says the people did not understand what was about to take place in Noah's day. And they will not understand what will take place in the coming of Christ. So how could that be? They didn't understand what was about to take place because we read in 2 Peter chapter 2 that Noah was a preacher of righteousness, and he was telling the people about the coming deluge. What's there to not understand? And even today, what's there to not understand about the apocalypse? People have Bibles in every hotel room. And they generally know that Christians are teaching that Christ is going to come and there's going to be an apocalypse. Well, even though they have a general knowledge, they never personalize it. Our understanding and our discernment is a function of our moral spiritual condition. We set our minds to understand and focus on the things in which we take the most interest. And when people are unconnected from God, the things of God are considered foolishness. It's not even in their thoughts. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they're spiritually appraised. Well, in Matthew 24:40, Jesus goes on to explain a little bit more about the surprise. Then there'll be two men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at a mill. One will be taken and one will be left. Given what Jesus has just taught, this has to be a further explanation of what Jesus just said about gathering his elect from the four winds. Back at verse 31. Just like Paul explains it further in 1 Thessalonians 4, that we're going to meet the Lord in the air. Now, there are a few who try to interpret this as the ones who are taken to judgment, and the ones who are left behind are the ones who are blessed and going into the millennial kingdom. But that does not follow what Jesus just said about gathering his saints from the four winds. And the illustration of Noah and the ark is that the people of God are taken off the earth, and the unsaved are left behind for the destruction. So that's a little aside for those people who have those deeper questions. But this text about those being left behind, in various prophetic messages and books, and of course in the Left Behind series, depict cars crashing when their drivers disappear, airplanes crashing when the pilots disappear, and that there are piles of clothing left on the ground. And that many of the people of this world will see the great absence of God's people and turn to Christ. Some even see that all of the children will be raptured off the earth. But that perspective is coming from a pre-tribulational, dispensational rapture perspective, that after the rapture of the church, there's going to be 3.5 years of peace for Israel. And then after that, there's going to be 3.5 years of great tribulation. But for what it's worth, I have a little bit different view of what this is going to look like. Take it with a grain of salt. I just see that the number of believers on earth are so few that most of the world isn't going to miss us. The world is going to be so busy running for cover from these apocalyptic judgments that the absence of the church will be the least of their concerns. Because I see the rapture happening, according to Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then he will gather his elect. So the world will be in the full throes of the Great Tribulation. And what the world is going to be doing, we read about in Revelation chapter 6, verse 16. They're going to be hiding in the caves and in the rocks and in the mountains, saying, "Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" Well, In closing, let's just set aside the academic analysis of this text. And let's not miss the earth-shaking warning here that some are going to be taken and some left behind. God is love, but there's not going to be universal salvation. And God is serious about saving those who are his followers and judging those who choose against Christ. Acts chapter 4, verse 12, there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name given among men whereby we must be saved. I was listening to a pastor from Ireland give an interesting message on Revelation 7:14, speaking about those who are saved from the wrath of God in the tribulation. Revelation 7:14, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes, and they made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And this pastor pointed out something I never saw before. They have washed their robes is not in the passive tense. It's in the active tense. They have their robes, it's not that they have their robes washed for them, but they have washed their robes. So humanly speaking, despite of all we know about God's sovereign election, we need to come to Christ for the forgiveness of sins. You and I need to turn to Christ. We need to pray the sinner's prayer. It's our responsibility to be made righteous by choosing Christ. He provides the righteousness, but we need to have our souls washed in the blood of the Lamb.